People who have been catfished, how did you catch on that you were being lied to? About 7 years ago, I catfished my then-boyfriend because I had a strong suspicion that he was trying to cheat on me. I'd caught him chatting with other women online a few times before, and it wasn't just innocent conversation. There were explicit messages, begging for explicit pictures, trying to get them to come over, you name it. Each time I caught him, he would cry and beg for forgiveness, saying it was just chatting and that he wasn't actually going to do anything, promising it wouldn't happen again. But I wasn't stupid. I could tell something was off. I should have broken up with him after the first time, but I was younger, more naive, and more forgiving than I should have been. So, I decided to get a little creative. I made a fake Yahoo profile using random pictures of a hot girl from MySpace, named myself Ashley Adams, and created a backstory about being a cheerleader and body art model. The whole thing was ridiculously fake, but I knew he'd fall for it. He wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed, especially when boobies were involved. I added him as a contact and waited. It didn't take long before he took the bait. As soon as he saw the message pop up, he wasted no time. "Hey sexy, wanna chat?" Oh, I was ready. I played along, saying something like, "Of course, Ashley thinks you're cute too." He immediately asked me for pictures and wanted to know where I lived. I told him I was just one town over and could be there in half an hour. He eagerly gave me his address and said I could just come right in and jump on him when I arrived. I knew I had him now. I gave him about 15 minutes to stew in his own excitement before I headed over to his apartment. I let myself in just like he said. As soon as I walked in, his face went from excitement to sheer panic. He asked what I was doing there, and I acted innocent, saying I just wanted to spend some time with him. I could see him scrambling, trying to come up with an excuse for why I couldn't stay, but given that he was lounging in his boxers with the lights low, he didn't have many options. So, I made myself comfortable and didn't let on that I knew exactly what he'd been up to. I enjoyed watching him squirm, glancing nervously at the door every time he heard a noise, probably thinking Ashley would walk in any minute. I stayed for hours just to relish his discomfort, watching him grow increasingly nervous. When he realized Ashley wasn't showing up and tried to get frisky with me, I pretended to be suddenly unwell and made my exit. "Sorry, babe, I'm not feeling too good." A few days later, I broke up with him after finding actual proof of him cheating on his phone. But honestly, I have to admit, catfishing him was pretty fun. He got what he deserved, and I'm glad I made him squirm. What a stupid guy. Story 2. In my sophomore year of college, my friend Carrie, a 19-year-old guy, met a girl named Kelly in an online chat room. They connected quickly, sharing deep conversations and developing a close bond over time. They spent hours chatting, and Carrie even began to feel like Kelly could be someone special in his life. One day, out of nowhere, Kelly confided in Carrie that her boyfriend had physically harmed her and had even broken her jaw. Concerned and heartbroken for her, Carrie, driven by a sense of compassion, decided to take action. Without hesitation, he drove several hours to a city far from home to rescue Kelly from the dangerous situation she had described. However, when he arrived, he was in for a devastating shock. Kelly wasn't who she claimed to be. The person he had been talking to for months wasn't a woman at all, but rather a man named Kenny. Kenny, it turns out, had been manipulating Carrie all along. After revealing his true identity, he tortured Carrie into giving up all of his personal passwords before brutally attacking him. Carrie's body was found abandoned in a remote field, left to rot as a gruesome message of betrayal. But it didn't stop there. Kenny, desperate to cover his tracks, impersonated Carrie online for several days, trying to fool friends and family into thinking Carrie was still alive. He did a poor job, though, and his actions didn't go unnoticed for long. The police quickly caught onto the trail, and before he could face trial for his horrific crime, Kenny offed himself while in jail. It may sound bizarre, with all the similar-sounding names, Carrie and Kelly, Kenny, but I swear this is a true story. You can even look it up. To this day, I can't shake how unsettling and messed up it all was. It messed with my head for a long time. Story 3. About 6 years ago, I discovered that my brother had been catfishing someone. He had been pretending to be a completely different person while living in the US, using fake pictures and a false name. The only real thing he had was his actual phone number. The person he had been deceiving, let's call him Lenny, was in the UK, and he had no idea he was being manipulated. Lenny would call our house phone repeatedly, leaving messages, desperate to connect. My brother and Lenny would also send each other packages full of sweets, sharing little pieces of their lives. It seemed innocent at first, just online friendships, but it became clear over time that Lenny was really invested in the relationship. Eventually, Lenny decided he wanted to take things to the next level and travel to the US to visit my brother. He had never been to America, and he thought it would be the perfect chance to meet face to face. My brother, strangely enough, agreed to it. But when Lenny finally arrived in Texas, ready to meet the person he had spent months talking to, my brother dropped a bombshell. He told Lenny the truth. He wasn't the person he had been pretending to be. But he didn't actually meet up with Lenny in person to explain things or apologize. Lenny, heartbroken but still determined, tried for an entire week to convince my brother to meet him. He told him he just wanted to know who he really was, hoping that their connection could still mean something despite the deception. But my brother never agreed to meet him. After that, Lenny kept calling, day after day, for about a month. He was relentless, desperately trying to get my brother back, possibly because he had developed real feelings. It seemed like he genuinely loved my brother, even though he had been lied to the entire time. Eventually, Lenny stopped calling. I never heard from him again after that. It's still a strange, unsettling memory for me, and it makes me wonder what could have happened if my brother had been honest from the start. Story 4. When I was a freshman in high school, I got really into Neopets and was part of a tight-knit clique that I ran with on the boards. We'd chat regularly both on the site and off, keeping in touch through various messaging apps. Among those in my group were Shelby and Adam, who were about the same age as me and were dating at the time. Adam had a sister, Kelsey, who was also part of the clique, and we all got along pretty well. As is often the case with internet relationships, things eventually took a turn. Shelby and Adam broke up, and not long after, Adam and I started talking. We even began dating, though it was all online. Shelby was surprisingly supportive of it and gave us her blessing. Adam and I exchanged pictures, and he fit the typical emo aesthetic. Black hair, band tees, the whole look, which 14-year-old me found irresistible. We mostly communicated through text and shared a few phone calls, but I was very shy at the time, so I didn't mind the lack of voice interaction. Then, one day, Adam sent me a YouTube video. It was a clip of him and his friends hanging out, but there wasn't much talking in it, and the audio was muffled. I remember that the voices in the background sounded like they were speaking German. It struck me as a little odd, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Eventually, Adam and I broke up. Nothing too dramatic, just one of those things. But that's when the big reveal came. It turned out there was no Adam. The whole time, it had been Kelsey, his sister, posing as him. She had made him up entirely, creating an entire persona and pretending to be him online. At first, I was stunned and confused. I asked Shelby about it, and it turned out she had already found out when Adam and Kelsey broke up, but Kelsey had made her promise not to tell anyone. I couldn't believe it. I had been talking to Kelsey this whole time, thinking I was getting to know Adam. It felt like a total betrayal, and I couldn't help but laugh in disbelief at how far Kelsey had gone to keep up the lie. Story 5. When I was around 17, I used to spend some time on Omegle, a random chat site, just for fun. The site would often prompt you to answer basic questions, like your age and sex, male or female. Most people would disconnect as soon as I said I was male, so eventually, I started telling people I was female just to avoid being immediately kicked off, and to actually have a chance to talk to someone. One day, I connected with a girl, and we hit it off right away. We had a really good conversation that lasted about 2 hours, talking about everything and nothing. Eventually, we exchanged Skype addresses, and I quickly scrambled to create a new one. I didn't have a girly Skype address to match the fake name I had been using, so I came up with one on the fly. From then on, we started chatting almost every day. It was fun, and despite knowing that I was being dishonest by pretending to be a girl, I didn't want to stop talking to her. I did feel guilty, though, because I knew that, even though we lived relatively close to each other, we could never meet in real life. There was always that layer of deception hanging between us, and it started to weigh on me. Then, one day, she confessed something to me. She told me she had been lying to me as well. It turned out that she wasn't actually a girl, but was a guy, just like me. At first, I was surprised, but we both laughed it off and continued our friendship. We kept in touch regularly, and the fun never really stopped, even though we both knew the truth now. Eventually, we did meet in person. It was a strange, but fun experience, and we enjoyed the time we spent together. Sadly, 2 years later, he passed away. I was deeply saddened by the loss, but I still look back on those days with a sense of fondness. Despite the lies, we shared some good times, and I'm grateful for the unexpected friendship that came from it. Story 6. This story doesn't involve me directly, but it's about my father-in-law. 7 years ago, he lost his wife, and after a while, he started feeling the weight of an empty house and the isolation that comes with it. It was tough on him, not having anyone around to talk to or share things with. Eventually, he decided to try online dating. Unfortunately, he made the mistake of going to a free dating site, where things took a turn he wasn't expecting. He started chatting with a woman who claimed she lived in Chicago. She said she was an international traveler for business, always on the go. She sent him pictures, and they seemed to hit it off. She was friendly, engaging, and it all seemed too good to be true. After chatting for a few weeks, they made plans to meet once she returned from her business trip. He'd excitedly tell us about this amazing woman he'd met, sharing little details here and there, but we didn't want to be too intrusive, so we didn't press him with questions. We were happy for him, hoping he was finding someone to bring a little joy back into his life. What was especially lucky was that her return trip lined up with Thanksgiving weekend, when the entire family was gathered at his house. She was supposed to fly in on Saturday, and he kept excusing himself to his room, taking private calls with her about the details of her trip. But then, on Friday, he came downstairs looking defeated. He said he'd received a heartbreaking message from her. She claimed that while she was waiting for her flight in Europe, her purse had been stolen. She was left without any money, ID, credit cards, or even her tickets. Stranded in a foreign country she'd never visited, she needed him to send money so she could make her way back home. If it hadn't been for the fact that we were all there, I'm pretty sure he would have sent her a couple of $1,000s. But something didn't sit right with me. I immediately started asking questions about the details, and that's when I started getting suspicious. I explained to him the concept of catfishing and how this was likely a scam, but at first, he didn't believe me. To his credit, he tried to ask her for more specific details. He asked how she was managing to reach him without a phone. She claimed she was borrowing laptops at the airport. He also questioned why they'd never spoken on the phone. Her response was that she was shy and preferred to communicate through the dating site. When he asked for the flight number to track her arrival in the US, she gave him one, but it turned out to be a fake flight number, and her claim of being stuck due to weather was false. When we called her out on these inconsistencies, she resorted to emotional manipulation, saying she was shaking in sadness and betrayal because he couldn't trust her after everything she'd shared. That's when she stopped providing any solid proof and began playing on his emotions, hoping to get a response. We all agreed to stop responding, but a day or two later, she messaged again, claiming that a friend had paid for a new ticket for her, but she still needed money to pay some sort of fine, or else she'd be stuck in the foreign country and possibly face jail time. She asked him, "Would you really want me to go to jail?" It was the same tactic, play on his sympathy to get him to act. Looking back, it sucked because he's such a trusting person, and even weeks after the fact, he wasn't entirely convinced that she wasn't real. The whole family tried to explain that it was clearly a scam, but he was so emotionally invested that he couldn't let go of the idea that she might be real. I even suspect that he sent her some money at the start to help with the supposed flight and ticket issues, but we didn't get involved until this stolen purse part came up. It was probably a man using stolen pictures online to create a fake persona. I tried doing an image search on one of the photos she'd sent him, but it came up empty, reinforcing our suspicions. The whole thing was a mess, but luckily, we were there to help him avoid losing even more money. The moral of this story is simple. If you have anyone over 50 in your life, especially someone who enjoys shopping, dating, or meeting new people online, make sure you explain to them the dangers of internet scams. The internet has opened up a whole new world of deception, and scammers are getting increasingly good at exploiting vulnerable people. I know several elderly individuals who have been scammed over the phone, but online scams add an entirely new level of risk. It's important to have these conversations and ensure they're aware of what to look out for. Story 7. About 10 years ago, I started chatting with a guy in one of the Yahoo chat rooms. We had only been talking for a few weeks when suddenly, he disappeared offline without any warning. I was really worried, but then, after about 2 weeks, I received a message from his sister, who told me that he'd been in a terrible motorcycle accident and was in ICU. She said he was okay, but still in critical condition. She kept me updated with regular messages, giving me updates on his recovery and letting me know how he was doing. At first, I was relieved to hear that he was still alive, but I also couldn't shake the feeling of anxiety. After about a month, he finally got back online, and we resumed our regular chats. We talked every day, and things picked up right where we left off. We even started sharing pictures, and eventually, I got on webcam to say hi, but he kept making excuses about why he couldn't show his face on webcam. He said he had some computer issues and couldn't get it to work. We continued chatting like this for nearly 3 years. I never thought much about the webcam thing, but as time passed, I started to notice small inconsistencies. There were moments when I began to suspect that his sister was actually him, but I couldn't be sure. The bond we had formed during all that time was too strong, and I was head over heels in love with him. I developed feelings for him in a way that went beyond just a typical online friendship. I was absolutely besotted. Then, one day, everything changed. His profile suddenly disappeared. All his accounts gone. No more messages, no more updates, no explanations. I searched everywhere for any sign of him, but nothing came up. I never heard a single word from him again. It was as though he vanished without a trace. I still have absolutely no idea who he really was, and the uncertainty of it all really messed with me for a long time. I think about it now and then, and there's a part of me that wishes I could find out the truth. I still wonder if he was someone completely different than what he had led me to believe. Was it all a lie? I'd do anything just to know who he or she really was, and what the whole thing meant. It still haunts me, and I can't help but feel that a part of me will never get closure on that chapter. Story 8. I actually unintentionally catfished someone. It all started when I was playing League of Legends. After a game, this guy added me, and his English was a bit broken, but it didn't raise any red flags for me at the time. We started duo ING together, and we actually did pretty well. But something strange started happening. He kept referring to me as she. I didn't think much of it and just kept playing, not really giving it any thought. Eventually, though, he started getting way too creepy. He began oversharing personal details about himself, and I started feeling uncomfortable. We also discovered there was a pretty significant time difference between us, but despite that, he'd log on at the most bizarre hours for him just to play with me. It was almost like he was trying to be my personal white knight. If anyone trash-talked me, which is pretty typical in League, he'd defend me aggressively. He'd start fights with opposing players, and anyone who said anything bad about me. As time went on, he started saying goodnight BB, which I just took as a casual goodbye. So, I'd respond with something like, haha, goodnight BB, not thinking anything of it. Then, he'd send me heart emojis and I thought we were just joking around as guys do. So I'd send the heart back in a playful way. But it didn't stop there. Eventually, he started referring to me as his girlfriend when defending me, and that's when it hit me. He full-on thought I was a girl this whole time. I had to come clean. So after the next game, I messaged him and said, dude, I'm actually a guy. He completely lost it. He went on a full-on rant, cussing me out and just going wild. As the messages went on, I finally found out why he thought I was female. He assumed it because of my username and because I used proper grammar and spelling. He actually thought that was a female trait. To be fair, just because I didn't make mistakes in my messages doesn't mean I'm perfect at grammar, but it was still wild to hear that as the reason why he got so confused. Story 9. I was probably around 19, and I was pretty bad with women at the time. I was really into role-playing, particularly on MUXs, kind of like a role-play-focused, all-text MMO. I met this girl on one of the MUXs. She was a senior in high school, and I had just graduated. We started chatting online, and it quickly moved to let's call and talk about our role-play plots, which eventually turned into us say, I love you after only a couple of weeks. We had a lot of fun. I did some dumb things like scanning photos of myself and sending them to her, and she did the same. We'd stay on the phone until 3 a.m., laughing about stupid stuff until her dad would come in and tell her to hang up. She was the first girl I ever been intimate through phone, and to this day, I still get a weird tingle whenever I see girls in videos using the bathtub for themselves. This was all before camera phones, so everything was just based on imagination, but we made it work. Then, as things usually go, the calls started becoming less frequent. Soon, the letters I sent her weren't being responded to at all. Eventually, she just stopped talking to me completely. That's when I started to put the pieces together. Her photos were always weirdly distant, like group shots or school pictures of a girl I didn't know. Then there were the letters, which kept coming back with return to sender written on them. After a while, she gave me a new address, but it still didn't sit right. All the signs were there, but I kept ignoring them because I didn't want to believe it. I think, at least in my theory, she probably had some feelings for me. But I also think she was a lot younger than she was claiming. I used to talk about her moving to my state so we could be together, and I think that might have freaked her out. Maybe her parents found out she was talking to someone older, and that's why she cut contact. The romance felt real on both sides. I enjoyed making her laugh and coming up with silly plans, and it seemed like she genuinely enjoyed my company too. But I guess, at 17, it's pretty easy to laugh at almost anything. So, if your name was Rashni, or if you pretended to be someone named Rashni in the early 2000s, no hard feelings. Thanks for laying the foundation and making my current long-distance relationship a whole lot easier. And every time I think about our imaginary son, Spaghetti Bucket, I smile and wish you well. Story 10. I had a friend in high school who told us this wild story a week after it happened, at a graduation party. So, he had been chatting with this girl from Florida for 3 years. After our high school graduation, he finally decided to go visit her for a week. He was excited, but little did he know, things were about to take a strange turn. He flew down there, and she was supposed to pick him up at the airport. When he landed, though, he was greeted by a woman who claimed to be her mother. She told him that her daughter was waiting for him at the house, so he grabbed his bags and hopped in the car with her. As they drove, he noticed a guy around his age sitting in the back seat. Oddly enough, he didn't remember her mentioning a brother, which made him start feeling a little uneasy. They finally pulled up to the house, but the girl still wasn't anywhere to be found. At this point, he was pretty frustrated and demanded the mother tell him what was going on. And that's when the truth came out. This woman wasn't her mom at all. She had been using her niece's pictures to talk to him for all these years. How he didn't catch on sooner, I have no idea. Maybe they never talked on the phone. Maybe her voice just sounded younger than he expected. Anyway, he immediately bailed on the situation. He ditched the lady and her son, booked a hotel for the night, and the next day, he had his parents pay for a flight home. It was one of those stories that, once we heard it, we couldn't stop laughing about, but at the time, I bet he was completely freaked out. Story 11. I was catfished, but not in a romantic sense. This was a catfishing that took place through a friendship. This all started many years ago when I met a guy named Zach online. He lived in Pennsylvania, and we started chatting on MSN. Zach was a really nice guy, and we hit it off pretty quickly. We spoke daily for over a year, maybe even 2. During all that time, we never bothered with webcams, which, looking back, should have been a red flag, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Zach told me a lot about his life. He said his mother and sister had left him alone, and he had never met his dad, although he'd heard stories about his dad being a real jerk to his mom. He seemed lonely and often talked about wanting someone to talk to. One day, Zach came online, and something seemed off. He didn't sound like himself. I asked him what was going on, whether something had happened at school or with his friends. After a few minutes of back and forth, he said he needed to go on webcam, which I thought was strange, but I didn't think much of it at the time. When the webcam turned on, it wasn't Zach at all. Instead, it was this girl who looked to be about 14. She introduced herself and told me she was Zach. I was confused, but she claimed she had been Zach all along, and the person I had been talking to was really her. I tried to process what was happening, but it was hard to make sense of it. A few years later, I found out that Zach had passed. I don't know how it happened, and honestly, I didn't get many details about his passing. But when Zach passed away, his little sister had taken on his personality, speaking like him and even pretending to be him when she talked to me. She eventually came clean to her mother about the whole thing, and her mom reached out to explain everything. Her mother said that she believed she was Zach many times. She thought she was him. It turned out that all along, I had been speaking to a girl with mental health struggles who was pretending to be Zach. I felt a mix of shock, sadness, and disbelief. I had really enjoyed our conversations, and I had no idea that the person I thought was Zach wasn't him at all. It was a lot to process. To think that during all that time, Zach might not have even been alive, at least not in the way I had imagined, really messed with my head. Looking back, I still struggle to fully comprehend it. It was a strange situation, and sometimes I wish I had been older when it all happened, so I could have understood more about what was really going on. It's been about 10 years since it happened, and I'm only now piecing together bits of the story. It's a memory I'll never forget, though, and something I still think about often. Story 12. I came across a guy on Grindr with a cute profile picture, someone I'll call Redfish. I messaged him, honestly not expecting a reply, but to my surprise, he responded right away and seemed really eager to chat. He sent me a couple of pictures of his body, but I noticed his hands looked a lot bigger in one of them. I brushed it off, though, since my mind was elsewhere. Then, out of nowhere, I got a message from someone claiming to be Redfish's friend. Let's call him Catfish. He said they were really close and went to the same college. I replied politely, just making casual conversation, curious to see where this would go. Later that night, Redfish messaged me again, asking how I thought of Catfish. I told him he seemed fine, but I already had my suspicions, so I just played along to see how long this would drag out. I screenshot Redfish's profile picture and did a reverse image search on Google. It turned out the photo was all over Tumblr. After a few days of chatting with both Redfish and Catfish, Redfish spent most of the time talking about Catfish, and then, surprise, his account blocked me. I wasn't done yet, though. I messaged Catfish asking what happened with Redfish and why he blocked me. Catfish claimed he had no idea but said he would ask him. A little while later, Catfish came back and said Redfish wouldn't tell him why. So, I texted, 1 fish, 2 fish, Redfish, catfish. I know, it's cheesy, but I couldn't resist the Dr. Seuss reference. Catfish then sent me a long message about how shocked he was that I'd think he would do something like that. He went on about how he would never catfish someone because he had been a victim of it before, even going as far as saying he had to get a restraining order because of a stalker. I honestly didn't buy it for a second. Catfish wasn't exactly what I'd call attractive, and I thought it was a bit of an exaggeration. At that point, I told him I had Googled the profile picture, and he finally admitted to everything. He kept making excuses, saying he was tired of being on the sidelines and just wanted to be noticed, but not once did he acknowledge that what he did was wrong. He just kept justifying his actions, clearly not feeling any remorse. Story 13. I met this Welsh girl on 4chan who shared a lot of the same interests as me, bands, comedians, and political views. We hit it off right away and ended up talking for hours. We spent the next 3 months chatting nearly every day, sometimes for 6 to 8 hours at a time. She was amazing, funny, insightful, and introduced me to so much new music and movies. On top of that, she was just a genuinely kind and lovely person. At the time, I was struggling with depression, having dropped out of college the year before due to severe anxiety and a growing inability to function in public. She was the first person I ever felt truly comfortable with, and I found myself looking forward to each new day simply because I got to talk to her. We'd stay up late chatting or watching TV shows, and I found myself really falling for her. Then one night, she said goodnight, and we agreed to talk again the next day. The following day, though, she never came online. Days passed without a word, and I started to get really worried. I even started checking the news and obituaries in her town, hoping to find some kind of explanation, but there was nothing. At that point, I was panicking. I honestly thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing, that I was losing my mind. The anxiety and stress became unbearable, and I couldn't eat or sleep properly for weeks. I was obsessed with what could have happened to her, and it made me physically and mentally ill. I spiraled, and over time, it just kept getting worse, eventually leading to a complete nervous breakdown. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but eventually, I managed to pull myself together, and a few months later, I decided to dig deeper to get some closure. I stumbled across a profile on social media with photos that looked like they were hers, but when I dug further, I realized the pictures had been stolen. From there, I started unraveling the truth. Now, I'm in a much better place. I'm healthier than I've been in a long time, and while it's still strange, I don't feel as consumed by the whole experience. But every now and then, I think about her. I know now that it was probably someone else entirely, either a guy or someone using someone else's identity, but it still makes me sad knowing that I'll never get to talk to that person again. Despite how much it messed me up for a while, I'm better for it in the end. I just hope they're doing okay too. Story 14. I was in my early 20s when I met a girl on a chat board. She was about 19, attractive, and had a few pictures up, candid shots that didn't look overly posed or model-like, so I thought they were probably legit. After chatting online for a while, we moved to talking on the phone, and the relationship became more casual, eventually diving into conversations about physical relations, fantasies, and even some borderline intimate phone conversation. The catch was, she lived in the same city as me, so after a month or so, I said, "Hey, we should meet up or this isn't going anywhere." She gave me her address and told me to come by the next day. When I arrived, I found myself in a sketchy part of town, right near the penitentiary. The house looked like it should have been condemned years ago, and I started to get that gut feeling that this was a bad idea, but I wanted to see it through. There was a girl, probably the same age as me, sitting outside the house. She said she was the girl's friend and that she'd be back soon, so I should wait. She was nice enough, but she was very overweight, probably about 40 pounds heavier than the girl in the photos, and didn't look anything like her. Eventually, she let me inside and up to the bedroom. She was acting like she knew me and was friendly, but honestly, I was too horrified by the state of the house to really focus on what she was saying. The place was filthy, garbage everywhere, a stained mattress on the bed, and no furniture other than the floor. The place smelled like old ashtrays, and in the middle of summer, there was no air conditioning, so it was unbearably hot. The entire time, I didn't think it was the same girl. Her voice sounded off, and I wasn't sure if she was trying to make a move on me or just being overly friendly. After a while, it became clear that the girl I had been talking to wasn't going to show up, so I said goodbye and left. Later, she called me, offering some sad excuses. She even went out of her way to tell me not to confuse her with her friend because their voices were similar. She made a comment about her friend being overweight, to which I, in a moment of ignorance, responded with something like, "Yeah, she was a fat tie." She didn't like that and tried to brush it off, but it was obvious she was offended. I eventually figured out what had been going on, but she denied it when I confronted her, and we stopped talking. A few months later, she contacted me to say she was dating some guy, probably trying to make me jealous, but I wasn't. Then, another month or so later, she called me to say she was pregnant and dealing with all this drama. I just stopped answering her calls, and her emails were just more excuses about why we never met. The whole situation was just weird, and I can't believe it took me that long to see the warning signs. A few years later, the house she was living in was demolished by the city, and now it's just an empty lot. I still have no idea what happened to her. Story 15. Yes, I've been catfished, but it wasn't in a romantic way. Around 13 years ago, I met a girl named Amber on a Harry Potter fan site. We quickly became friends and talked every day. She was from England, and over time, she shared a lot about her family. She had an older brother, a twin sister, and a younger brother. As the years passed, she told me that she and her sister had discovered they were adopted and that their real names were Elena and Anuska. Things took an unexpected turn when, at 15, her sister Anuska became pregnant and had triplets. Although I always had a feeling that something wasn't quite right with her story, it didn't hit me until she sent me a photo of herself and her twin. The photo was clearly photoshopped, and after I called her out, she took it down. Then, she started emailing me from an account that had a last name that seemed off. I asked her about it, and she said it was her cousin's. She later sent me a song from iTunes that had the same last name, and when I asked about it again, she explained that it was a fake name her father used. When the last Harry Potter book came out, she sent me the British version, and once again, that same last name appeared on the package. I'd known this girl since she was about 11, so after all these years, I finally asked her point-blank at age 18 if she was really Elena. She confessed that her real name was Emma, that she didn't have a twin or a younger brother, and that when she was little, her parents had forbidden her from using her real name. She had created an entirely different life for herself to escape from her reality. Despite the lies she told me for most of our friendship, we're still close. We've worked through it, and although it was a big shock, we've remained good friends. Story 16. My sister was catfished by none other than her so-called best friend of 7 years. Her best friend had grown up with a guy, let's call him John, and one day she gave my sister his instant messaging handle and phone number, thinking they'd get along. My sister started talking to him regularly. At first, it was just friendly, but soon John began showing romantic interest. Over time, they started a relationship that lasted about 3 years. Throughout that time, John made excuses for not meeting up in person. Everything was always just messaging and phone calls. Though my sister was a little skeptical, she brushed it off because her best friend had known John for years and seemed to vouch for him, so she figured they'd meet eventually. Out of nowhere, after 3 years, John suddenly cut off all contact. My sister was devastated and desperate for an explanation. She asked for my help, as she had some personal information about him, and we decided to do some digging. To our shock, we traced his pictures and other details back to the Facebook profile of a random guy on the other side of the world. It didn't take long to figure out that the person behind the account was actually her best friend. She was completely sick to her stomach and beyond upset. I reached out to her best friend to confront her, telling her that we knew everything and demanding answers. All she kept saying was, "I don't know, I'm sorry." After years of lies and betrayal, that was the best explanation she could offer. My sister told her to go to hell, deleted her from everything, and hasn't spoken to her since. Story 17. This isn't my story, but my friend from high school was catfished in such a long and bizarre way that it became legendary at our school. He came out as bisexual during junior year, but never had the courage to ask a guy out. A few months later, he started talking about his new boyfriend from Japan. At first, we didn't think much of it, since many of us had been in long-distance relationships. However, as time went on, things began to feel off. He had his boyfriend on Facebook, but all the pictures were of various cosplayers that could easily be traced back online. He would send videos of his typical day to his boyfriend, but only ever received text and picture responses in return. He also constantly tried to set up Skype dates and meetups, even raising money for a trip to the US to meet his boyfriend. Thankfully, he never actually sent the money. Then things got really strange. His boyfriend supposedly couldn't come to the US because he was dying. He claimed that a car accident in his childhood had caused internal bleeding that made him extremely sick. So sick, in fact, that the day he was supposed to travel, he passed out at the airport and had to be rushed to the hospital. My friend believed it, even though his mom, who was a nurse, told him it was impossible to still have internal bleeding from an injury so many years ago. This news sent him into a deep depressive spiral. Eventually, we figured out who was behind the catfishing. It was an obnoxious girl from our school who had become obsessed with my friend. When we confronted her, she denied everything and continued the charade. Then, the fake Japanese boyfriend passed away, but the story didn't end there. A few weeks later, my friend, still desperate for emotional support, started dating his fake boyfriend's roommate. The relationship lasted over a year, and at some point, the girl behind the catfishing stopped trying to hide it. My friend believed her story that the girl couldn't make her own profile because she lived in Japan. When he tried to get her to visit him, she eventually claimed to have taken her own life due to the pain of losing her roommate. My friend believed all of it. It took months for him to recover, and even longer before he finally accepted the truth that the girl from our school was the one who had orchestrated the whole thing. Story 18. This is a very long story of how I caught a catfish using my pictures and information. Sorry, I'm not the best storyteller, but bear with me. Back in high school, my friends and I would often find fake profiles made of us on different social networking sites. It was weird, but not something that felt alarming, just more of an annoying nuisance. That is, until one day, I was on Last.fm browsing through my neighbors, and the person with the most music in common with me had a profile using my pictures. So, like any 16-year-old would, I confronted them with a WTF in the comments section. The account was deleted immediately after that, and it was so strange to realize someone was using my pictures and listening to the same exact music as me. Anyway, this kind of thing continued for years, but nothing too harmful came of it. Fast forward to my 21st birthday. I'm expecting a package from my aunt, but when the UPS guy shows up, I see the package is from someone named Kin, not my aunt. I open it to find a pillow soaked in some awful-smelling cologne, a necklace with a worn-out heart pendant, cough drops, and a card signed by Kin. I'm seriously freaked out because I don't know who this is from. I throw everything in the garage and look this guy up on Facebook, message him, and he doesn't believe me when I say I have no idea who he is. He insists that we've been talking for years and that I've just forgotten. At this point, I'm feeling like a detective. I keep pressing him, and eventually, he starts to believe me. He admits he had seen my profile before and tried to add me because he suspected that the catfish wasn't who she said she was. She'd always make excuses about not wanting to video chat or meet up. She told him it was because I had a boyfriend. I did. And she wanted to keep their relationship a secret. He tells me they've been talking for 5 years, and he even sends me a link to her Tumblr. Turns out, she's been using my pictures and my entire personal life. This guy knew everything about me, from my dad passing away due to alcoholism to what my friends and I had done a few nights ago. We tried to come up with a plan to figure out who she really was, but he was very hesitant, which I found strange. Then he says it wouldn't even matter who she really was because the connection they shared was so deep. In my head, I'm like, dude, you literally know nothing about this person. Why? Anyway, our brilliant plan was for him to keep talking to her as if nothing was wrong to get more information, but that backfired. He suddenly stopped talking to me, and a few days later, I get a message on Facebook from the catfish, a picture of Ninetails, not her, threatening me. She demands I tell her what was in the box, or she'll make my life hell. I'm like, oh no. So, she starts hacking into my accounts and being generally annoying. After some more drama, I finally managed to get her to talk to me on AIM. I empathize with her, pretending to understand, and she eventually opens up. Turns out, she's a 17-year-old girl from Iowa. I even get her to turn on her webcam to prove she's telling the truth. So yeah, this 30-year-old guy had been talking to a 17-year-old for 5 years. Yikes. I kept tabs on her for a while, but after a bit, I just forgot about it. Occasionally, I'd get random messages on Tumblr from people saying they missed me. It seemed like she had a habit of talking to a lot of mentally unstable people. I even still get messages from one guy who rambles about his OCD and how I'm the only person he can talk to. I feel bad for these people. Besides that, things seem to settle down. I ended up moving across the country when I was 22. I was on OkCupid looking for new friends and maybe some casual encounters when a guy messaged me, asking if I still wanted to meet up and smoke. He told me that someone pretending to be me had been trading my nudes. I was a camgirl at the time, for World of Warcraft subscriptions. I knew immediately it was her again, since she and the 30-year-old guy had met while playing League of Legends. I confronted her, and she blocked me. At this point, I figured it was more serious, but I tried to brush it off. Nothing else happened until I was 25, working at my last job, and a guy came in. Turns out, the catfish had been talking to him for a year and a half on WhatsApp and told him to meet me at my job. Thank God, he wasn't a psycho. He was a lawyer from Canada, and he told me to find a lawyer in the States immediately. Now, I feel like I'm in hiding for eternity, because this never seems to stop. It's probably one of the most annoying things I've ever had to deal with. Story 19. A few years ago, I got catfished on OkCupid. Her profile picture showed a girl who looked pretty fit, probably around 130 to 140 pounds, white with brown hair and a cute face. If I had to rate her, I'd say she was around an 8.5/10. Her profile said she enjoyed running, hiking, and other outdoor activities, which seemed like fun. I'm not super attractive, but I'm pretty fit, and I consider myself on the high side of average when it comes to looks. We talked for a few days on the website and texted back and forth. After about 3 or 4 days, we decided to meet up. She sounded like someone I could enjoy getting to know. We agreed to meet at an Applebee's about halfway between our places. She showed up about 10 minutes late, and when I saw her, I was shocked. This was not the same person from the picture. She was at least 300 pounds and African American, completely different from her profile. She introduced herself, and before we even ordered food, I asked her why she had used a different picture from what she actually looked like. I can't remember exactly what she said, but it was something like, "I didn't want people judging me based on my appearance." Fair enough, but if that's the case, then don't put a picture up at all. I told her I wasn't interested in continuing the date and was going to head home. She got upset and called me shallow. You know what? Fine. I'd rather be shallow than dishonest. And that's how I met Stacy, the big fat liar. Story 20. I accidentally catfished someone, and I think I might have fallen in love with him. I've never told anyone this story before. It started when I was playing an online game, just chatting with this guy. I was in 10th grade, so about 15 or 16 years old. He asked me how old I was, and I panicked, picking a random age, 24. He told me he was 18, and immediately, I regretted not saying my real age. We ended up talking for the next few years. I think I loved him, or at least I felt as much as someone can love another person they've never met. We texted constantly, back when texts cost minutes, so it wasn't cheap. We also did webcam, but always kept it PG. I wonder if he knew I was younger, but if he did, he never said anything about it. We had plans to meet up several times, but I always had to back out. I was in high school, and I couldn't imagine how to explain it. I even thought about going to college near his area, but I couldn't figure out how to make that work. In the end, I just faded away because I couldn't bring myself to confess the truth, and I was consumed with guilt. I might have even faked a relationship in real life. Honestly, I can't remember. The details I shared with him were mostly true, but I had to make up things like my profession and living situation to make myself seem more like an adult and less like a high schooler. I still think about him sometimes, especially when I catch a Detroit Lions game on TV because he was a huge fan. I know his full name, so every now and then, I check up on him on Facebook just to see that he's doing well. I hope he is. Even though I'm now 26, in a committed relationship and happy, I still wonder what could have been if I had told him I was 16 instead of 24. What if I had really gone to college near him? Would we have worked out? He's hilarious and kind-hearted, and sometimes I wonder if he ever thinks of me, too. Or maybe I'm just a distant memory to him now. After all, we were just kids. Story 21. I've been catfished twice, and I didn't realize it until I met them. The most recent one was through OKC. He was the first person I responded to after signing up, and he seemed really interesting. His pictures were decent, he had a great job, a sense of humor, and we connected well. We planned a sushi date since I had recently discovered my love for it. I joked about being terrible with chopsticks, and he mentioned he had spent time in Japan and offered to teach me how to use them. I also told him how excited I was about the new Pinkberry that opened near me, so I promised to take him there since he'd never been. When we met, I realized he was at least 10 years older than in his photos and probably 100 pounds heavier. I was confused and wondered if I had the right person. But then he gave me a gift, training chopsticks that were connected at the top, so I knew it was him. At dinner, I didn't even need the chopsticks because he ate everything with his hands, claiming it was the authentic way. I didn't mention the differences between his photos and real life because I didn't want to be rude. We didn't have a second date, and a few days later, he sent me a nasty message for rejecting him and not taking him to Pinkberry. The other time was someone I met through WoW. We'd been in the same guild for about a year, and I had a crush on him the whole time. We exchanged real-life pictures on the guild forum, and I was definitely attracted to him. He often mentioned how he wished we could meet, and I thought, why don't we? He was at Ohio State, and I was at RIT in upstate New York, but I didn't mind road trips, so I went for it. When we met, it was clear he had used fake pictures. He smelled terrible, and his apartment was disgusting. It was around 1 a.m., and I was exhausted from the drive, just wanting to sleep and head home. He insisted I couldn't sleep on the couch because his roommate's friend was there, and tried to get me to share his tiny bed instead. I declined, slept on the floor, but he ended up down there with me, getting closer and closer. Eventually, I crawled under his bed to get away from him and slept there, then drove home the next day. Raiding in the guild was awkward after that, but the guild ended up falling apart shortly after. Story 22. This happened back in late June or early July of this year. One of my more nerdy friends, let's call him Jay, he's really just someone I've had a few classes with over the years, DMs me on Twitter. He says that one of his friends wants me to have her number because she thinks I'm hot. We'll call her S. So, I end up texting S, and it quickly becomes clear that she's a person with a high drive for intimacy. She goes into detail about multiple fantasies she's had about me, and the whole time, I'm thinking, there's no way this is real. I'm totally getting catfished. The next day, I woke up to 26 new texts from her, 11 of which are explicit pictures of herself. I'm in shock because I never asked for them, or even mentioned anything like that. They just came out of nowhere. The weird thing is, it's obvious these pictures are all of the same girl. So either this girl I've never heard of actually exists, or someone on the other end is really dedicated to this. A few weeks go by, and I invited her to a few parties, but S always had some excuse to decline. At this point, I'm pretty sure this is some kind of elaborate prank. So, I go talk to Jay again, and he says that she's very open and uncensored about physical intimacy and that she definitely exists, she just keeps to herself. I decided to show him the face of the girl in the pictures, and he says it's not her, and the girl in the photos is way hotter than S. So, I end up calling her out on the fake pictures, and this is where it gets interesting. She admits that she lied about her looks and her name because she didn't want me to know who she was. She tells me that she's been observing me around school for a year, completely obsessed with me. She even claims we've shared classes before and talked multiple times, but I have no idea who she is. Now, I'm kind of intrigued, so once school starts, I'm definitely going to try to figure this out. Story 23. For at least a few years, I had an online female persona that I adopted. It started when I played an online video game. I began as myself but had trouble making friends or really connecting in the game. I played on role-playing servers, but I was always too nervous to jump into interactions with others. I was on the verge of quitting, so I created a female character just to see what would happen. My idea was that if I made a female character, people might engage with her, and I could eventually redirect them to my real character. But, of course, things didn't go as planned. For simplicity, let's call this female persona Jane. Before long, I started meeting some really cool people in the game. We played together regularly, and eventually, they wanted to talk outside the game. So, I created an email for Jane and got onto MSN Messenger to chat. I'm not sure why I decided to lie about my identity. To be honest, it was a long time ago, and I don't even know if I fully understood what I was doing at the time. From that point on, Jane took on more of the real me. I started talking about things that were really going on in my life, and it felt nice to have people who genuinely cared. In reality, I had family and friends, but it wasn't the same. I was never really vocal with those people, and it felt wrong to talk about my feelings as a guy. But as Jane, I could talk about things that were bothering me, or just how I felt, and the people I'd befriended online really cared about Jane. Life wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great either. I was in a strange phase where I didn't know what I was doing with my life. I had a series of dead-end jobs, but mostly, I just felt alone. My roommate had a girlfriend he spent a lot of time with, and my other friends had their significant others. I was always the one without anyone. I felt alone a lot. Being Jane helped with that. It made me feel accepted and loved, though not romantically, at least at first. After being Jane for a while, I made a lot of friends online. One of them, let's call him John, stood out. John was cool. He reminded me of myself in some ways. We had a lot in common. We liked the same movies, played video games together, and we were both a bit unlucky in life, though not in terrible ways. It was nice to come home after a long day at a miserable job, get on my computer, and talk to John. He always wanted a picture of Jane, but I didn't have any, until one day, I was on a different forum and saw a cute girl posting pictures of herself. Not a model, just an average person posting her pics, so I used those. In hindsight, I realized just how wrong that was. A few years into our friendship, John admitted he had feelings for Jane, and that freaked me out. I knew it was happening in the back of my mind, but I never did anything to stop it. If anything, I dragged him along the whole time. I spent a good hour staring at that message, not knowing how to respond. John loved Jane, but Jane wasn't real. Except she kind of was. She was me. Her entire story was mine, just with her name instead of mine. All my good days, bad days, friends, bosses, they were all shared between me and Jane. The only real difference was that I was a guy. Sure, there were differences in how Jane acted compared to me in real life, but in a way, she was an unhindered, unfiltered version of me. And some guy I had been talking to for years had fallen for that. To this day, I feel terrible about what I put John through. I have no idea what happened to him afterward. I hope he's doing well and has moved on with his life. But there's a nagging feeling that he might still be out there, looking for his Jane. I hope he found someone, but I'll never know, and I don't deserve to. Aside from that, I met a lot of amazing people and, sadly, lied to each and every one of them. Interestingly, one of the first female friends I made as Jane came to me near the end of my time being Jane and confessed that she had done the same thing. It was relieving to hear that I wasn't the only one. She had done it for similar reasons. She was going through a tough time in her life and found comfort in being someone else online. I know that what we did wasn't right, but knowing that I wasn't alone in it helped a little. Anyway, it's all over now. It's been a few years since I stopped being Jane online, and life has gotten better. It's not perfect, but it's better. Maybe I grew up, or maybe I just found people who don't make me feel so lonely. I do occasionally think about Jane. I think about what I did, and it does make me feel sick. But I'm not going back to that. It's over. Story 24. This happened to a close friend of mine at the time. Let's call her Alyssa, and the catfish John. She was in high school back then. Alyssa added one of her friend's friends on Facebook because she thought he was super attractive. He looked like the perfect, photoshopped teenage guy, just flawless. They started talking, and it turned out he lived fairly close to her, but still just far enough away that calling him would be long distance. They began chatting all the time, every day, and she would sometimes ignore me and our group of friends just to talk to him on MSN or Facebook. She quickly fell head over heels for him, and we were all pretty surprised by how dedicated she was to him. Now, Alyssa wasn't exactly considered conventionally pretty. She was on the bigger side, and I didn't understand why someone who looked like him would be interested in her. But they started dating, and their phone calls became a big issue for her mom since she was racking up insane phone bills, like $300 a month. Eventually, after all their talking, Alyssa decided she wanted to meet him in person, but he seemed hesitant about it. It felt strange, and then he finally confessed that he wasn't the guy in the pictures. Instead of being this tall, blonde Adonis, he was actually a short, fat brunette. Alyssa was crushed for a while, and when I talked to her about it, I told her he seemed really suspicious. But she kept insisting that they'd invested so much time talking, and she still wanted to stay in the relationship. It went on for a while, and I even spoke to him a couple of times on the phone, but he still seemed off to me. Every time they tried to meet up, he had an excuse. His grandpa passed away, his mom needed him to watch his little brother, just a bunch of things. Eventually, I got fed up with hearing the same story over and over and watching Alyssa keep chasing after this guy, so our friendship started to fade. I couldn't keep hearing about him all the time. But then I found out from another friend that John wasn't actually John at all. It was a girl, someone with a really deep voice. I'm not sure how Alyssa handled it, but she ended up wasting 3 years of her life on a relationship with someone who wasn't even real. She hasn't had a serious relationship since, though she's been with most of the guys I considered the worst in high school. Story 25. I got catfished on Neopets. For 2 years, I was really close with another trader on the NC boards. He was an attractive gay guy with an equally attractive boyfriend. They both had these elaborate, complicated lives. He was a doctor's son with Crohn's disease, and his boyfriend was a trust fund kid with family in France and an Asian grandmother. They both had impressive GPAs, and his boyfriend was applying to one of the top universities in the US. There were a few red flags, though, like how they were both only a little younger than me but weren't allowed to have Facebook, or how they hardly ever posted, especially the boyfriend. They didn't have many pictures except a couple of profile shots. Still, he seemed like a real person to me. He opened up about his struggles, including being an abuse victim and going to court for it, and I shared my own problems with him. He gave me genuinely helpful advice, and I felt like I had a real friendship with him. He never asked for money or anything, just traded NC items with me, and we even exchanged gifts for birthdays and Christmas. Then one day, he just disappeared. He said he was going to university and would be busy for a while. But a mutual friend of ours reverse Googled the photos, and it turned out they were from a Spanish model's photo bucket account. It turns out these two hot guys were actually one lonely, overweight girl. I felt sad about it, honestly. I could have been friends with her if she'd just been honest. It felt like she had projected all her real-life struggles through these two perfect characters. She'd gone to so much effort to create these detailed personas, but in the end, she was just like me, another lonely person. The strangest thing, though, was when I introduced my real-life best friend to both of them. They hit it off at first, But then she accused my friend of trying to hit on her boyfriend and got really jealous. It was bizarre. I've since lost weight and moved on, but I'll never forget the connection we had or the kindness she showed me. However, that level of deceit is toxic, and I don't think I could ever be friends with the real person behind it all. Story 26. Years ago, I met a girl on Omegle. I was new to internet chatting and had heard about Omegle, so I figured I'd give it a try. After a few conversations, I ended up talking to this girl. She was cool and funny, and before we finished chatting, she asked if we could exchange emails to stay in touch. We swapped emails for a few days and then moved to Messenger. Within a couple of weeks, she was calling me. Eventually, she was telling me she loved me and making all these plans for our future. I liked the attention, but something felt off, so I was definitely suspicious. After a few months of chatting every day, I asked her how many other guys she chatted with online. She told me she only spoke to me. But then, other guys' names would randomly come up in our conversations, and I started getting jealous. I began to wonder if she was telling them the same things she was telling me. Eventually, I lost interest, realizing that I was never actually going to meet her. Bored, I started asking her for nude pictures of herself, even though I hadn't really cared about that before. We had done some sexting and roleplay, but I was just pushing boundaries to see what would happen. She declined, and that only made me more bored and curious about how she interacted with other guys. So, I decided to flip the script and created a fake persona. I knew she used Reddit, so I made an account, contacted her, and within a few messages, she gave me her email. The next week, we were chatting, and within hours, we were role-playing. It didn't take long before I got her to make a video, exactly to my specifications. In just a couple of weeks, I had several videos and pictures from her, all customized. And then, she disappeared. Turns out, she got married to the guy she told me she'd broken up with. They had been together for years. I think she got married right after sending me her last video. I honestly felt bad for the guy. Story 27. Here's my catfishing story. I'd known this person for almost a year before I realized what was happening. We met in an online game, though I'm not sure I want to name the game. On one hand, I don't want others to fall into the same trap, but on the other, I feel like it might be petty. Regardless, we met in the game and ended up in the same roleplay guild. This person stood up for me, had my back, and seemed like they were becoming a really close friend. I made the mistake of dating the guild leader, and when that ended badly, this person and I grew even closer. They comforted me and made me feel better. It wasn't long after that they started to ask me out, and I agreed. Before all this, though, there were a few warning signs. For one, she never wanted to do video calls or would turn off audio and video when we did. But I didn't think much of it. This person had been so supportive, and I wanted to believe everything they told me. Eventually, I asked why she wouldn't use video, and she told me she had schizophrenia. She also said that after an accident with her first girlfriend, who passed and left her with a throat injury that made her mute, she avoided video because it was too painful. I was 22 at the time, and she told me she was 19. I didn't question it. Then she started asking me out, and I said yes. I'd never dated a woman before, but I had always known I was attracted to them. She sent me pictures. She was beautiful, with big eyes and long wavy hair. The relationship quickly escalated, and I grew even more attached, convinced this person was my soulmate. But things quickly got weird. She would often mention her dead girlfriend and how she could never compare to her, and she constantly made me feel bad for not being physically there for her. She had moved to Tel Aviv to take care of her family and kept rubbing it in that I couldn't afford to visit her. I was in school at the time and couldn't afford a flight, but I would have gone if I could. She used her dead girlfriend's memory against me, claiming that she could never be happy because of her condition and that she was afraid she would have to live in a hospital because of her schizophrenia. I tried to reassure her, even buying a book to help me understand how to support her better. In hindsight, I can't believe I was so blind. She also said some odd things like how she'd love me even if I were a man, which was strange given that I was clearly a woman. Eventually, I started getting suspicious. The car crash she claimed killed her girlfriend supposedly happened in Chicago, but no records or details could be found. She sent me pictures of her ex-girlfriend, who she claimed she would always hold on to, but one of the pictures was clearly fake. It was of a girl standing on a cliff in South Africa, nowhere near Tel Aviv. I decided to dig deeper and cross-reference the pictures she sent me of her ex. It turned out that the dead girlfriend was actually alive and living in the Philippines. I confronted her, and she freaked out, accusing me of not loving her and of being just like everyone else who doubted her. And just like that, she disappeared. I was embarrassed, and I confided in my friends. They were incredibly supportive, and even the guild we had been part of cut her off quickly. I joined OkCupid not long after, mostly to boost my confidence, And that's where I met my current boyfriend, who has been the sweetest person I've ever been with. Then, about a month into our relationship, I got an anonymous message asking for a commission. We started talking, and I realized it was her. Her speech patterns gave it away, and soon enough, she asked if I could forgive her for everything. I told her that if I knew the truth, I could forgive her, but that I needed to know. She finally admitted to being someone else, a man around my age who worked at a car dealership in Illinois. My boyfriend, after I told him everything, pointed out that if she truly had good intentions, she wouldn't have approached me like this, manipulating me all over again. I told the person that I forgave them but couldn't let them back into my life after everything. It was manipulative, hurtful, and not something I wanted to repeat. I try not to be ashamed of it, though. My new guild has been kind about it, saying they suspected something but understood it could happen to anyone. If it hadn't happened, I wouldn't have met my boyfriend or made some amazing new friends. So, if anyone reads this and sees similar red flags, maybe it'll help them recognize if they're being catfished too. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.